They say that when the sea lies flat as hammered bronze, when even the gulls hang silent above the deep, you may hear it, a slow, deliberate tolling, carried on the water like a heartbeat. Some swear it is a trick of the wind against the cliffs. Others that it is the song of whales, or the shifting of submerged stone. But the oldest tales call it something else, the bells of Atlantis. Not the city as Plato described it, a concentric jewel of science and arrogance, but a drowned place of worship, where towers fell with the tide and left their bronze voices to ring forever in the salt dark. It is a ghost story that comes to us in fragments. A fisherman who returned pale and trembling, claiming the waves had spoken. A pearl diver who refused to go down again, saying the sea below was not empty. Sailors who insisted the water tasted of smoke. Yet ghost stories, like tides, hide their source. And if you trace the current back far enough, it leads not only to myth, but to ash and stone, to an island torn in half by fire, and to a civilization that vanished in the space of a breath. Welcome to the Archive of Folly, where we walk the seam between what happened and what we remember happened. I am your archivist, and tonight we will follow the sound of those bells, not into Plato's philosophical parable alone, but into the sunlit harbors and quiet courts of the ancient Aegean, where trade ships once drew bright lines across the water, and where one summer the sea itself turned trader. If you find yourself drawn to these long voyages through history's mistakes, obsessions, and the echoes they leave behind, consider joining us here in the archive. Your company is welcome in every tide and every telling. The sound begins faintly one low note, then another like a distant summons. The year is not ours, but something older. The sky above the Mediterranean is pale and hard-edged. On the island of Thera, the vineyards are heavy with summer fruit. The Minoan settlement here hums with the unremarkable rhythm of prosperity. Fishermen mending nets by the harbor, potters leaning into their wheels, children tracing patterns in the dust, imitating the swirling spirals carved into palace walls. Thera was not the center of the Minoan world that lay further south, in Crete's great palace at Knossos, but it was a glittering satellite. Ships from Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levant docked here, unloading amphorae of oil, gold in small coiled ingots, faience beads the color of deep water. In return, Thera's craftsmen sent back their own treasures, wool dyed in rare purple, fine pottery painted with dolphins and lily, wine sweetened with sun and volcanic soil. The Minoans built with confidence, not in walls, but in open courtyards and pillared halls. They were a maritime people, their defenses carried on the sea itself. The fleet was their fortress, the wide horizon their moat. And in the painted ruins of Akrotiri, on Thera's southern coast, you can still see the shape of their days. Women in saffron dresses, hair piled high, standing at open windows. Ships with curling prows moving in festival procession. Blue monkeys leaping between flowering trees. It was a world that seemed permanent. Yet permanence is a lie the earth enjoys telling. Beneath Thera, the crust of the world was restless. This had happened before, in small tremors, in columns of steam at the shore, in the faint metallic taste of the well water. But in the summer that followed, the warning signs began to gather like storm clouds. Some said the goats would not graze in their usual pastures. Others whispered that the sunsets had grown redder, as though the sky had been drinking blood. If a bell could ring beneath the earth, perhaps it would have sounded then, but no one heard it clearly. Plato, writing more than 1,000 years later, would claim he heard a different sort of bell, a warning told to him in words, passed down from the priests of Sais to Solon, from Solon to his own teacher's teacher. He placed it not on Thera, not even in the Minoan harbors, but in a city far grander, a city that stood in a single day's sailing from the pillars of Heracles, rich beyond measure, proud beyond salvation. In his telling, the sea came for that city because its people had turned from virtue to greed. The gods, he said, do not tolerate hubris forever. But here on Thera, in the years before the end, no one knew they were living inside the prologue of a cautionary tale. The first great tremor arrived in the spring. Pots fell from shelves. In Acroteri, the elaborate wall paintings cracked along the plaster seams. Some fled inland to the higher slopes. Others stayed, sweeping the dust from their thresholds and telling themselves the danger had passed. But the island was only breathing in. The next breath would be out. Archaeologists know the rest in layers of ash, thicker than a man's height. First came the smaller explosion steam, tearing through rock, fountains of pumice churning the sea white. Then, over hours or days, the heart of Thera gave way. A column of smoke and stone punched into the sky, blotting out the sun. Lightning crackled inside the ash cloud. Entire hillsides peeled away, sliding into the caldera with a roar like the sea itself had split in two. On Crete, 60 miles away, the waves came in walls. Harbors were swept clean. Ships were hurled inland and left in fields. Fields themselves were salted with seawater, their harvests poisoned for years to come. For the survivors, there would have been no word like Minoan to describe themselves. No neat dividing line between myth and history. They would have spoken instead of a summer when the sun disappeared, when the sea rose up to kill, and when the sound, yes, a sound of something vast breaking beneath the earth, seemed to echo for months. Later, when the sailors told their children stories to explain the ruins on Thera, they may have spoken of a city swallowed whole, whose people were taken, but whose bells rang on. By the time those stories reached Plato's hands, they had gathered new coats of meaning, political warning, moral lesson, and the grandeur of a city too perfect to live. Yet the real city, in the real summer of ash, had no perfect walls. It had pottery left half-fired in its kilns, fishing nets hung to dry, olives heaped in baskets for pressing. It had lovers who promised to meet by the harbor that evening, parents who left bread to rise by the hearth. It had the sound of the wind through narrow streets, and the sudden, shuddering silence before the first explosion began. And if there is any truth to the bells, perhaps it is this, that somewhere in the silted dark, when the sea lies still enough, the vibrations of that day's stone cracking, towers falling still, tremble upward through the water, reaching the ears of those who happen to be listening. The waves that rolled from Thera's collapse did not stop at Crete. They traveled outward like the ripples from a stone thrown into a still pond. Only these ripples were mountains of water, carrying with them the wreckage of ships, the bodies of dolphins and men, the shredded remains of what had been a coastline. In the Cyclades, villages clung to the cliffs and prayed to gods who could no longer be reached. Along the coast of Anatolia, fishermen watched the sea retreat far beyond its natural limits, revealing a writhing, gasping bed of fish only to come charging back with the force of a charging bull. For the Minoans, this was not one disaster, but two. The first was the wave itself, the sudden obliteration of harbors, the drowning of coastal fields, the loss of fleets that had taken generations to build. The second was slower, a low unraveling. Volcanic ash settled over the eastern Mediterranean, veiling the sun. Crops failed. Trade routes fell silent. Without ships, the Minoan reach shrank to the fragile core of Crete itself. And when the Mycenaeans of mainland Greece looked across the water, they no longer saw an untouchable power, but a wounded rival. Here, in the thinning shadow of the Minoan palaces, myth began to root itself in the soil. The survivors spoke of light that had vanished at noon, of rain that stung the skin, of the sea's voice calling from beneath the waves. It was not yet Atlantis by name. Plato's pen would not move for centuries, but it was already a legend in the making. In Plato's telling, Atlantis fell in a single day and night of misfortune. The phrase is almost a whisper compared to what Thera must have been, a roar so loud it carried across nations. Yet for the philosopher, the violence of the destruction was not the point. Atlantis was a mirror held up to Athens, a parable about power and its corruptions. He wrote not to comfort survivors, but to warn the living. The island was a stage on which hubris played its final act. And yet, one wonders, could he have chosen such a stage without some earlier ruin in mind? Could the bones of Thera's catastrophe have lain buried in the cultural memory, waiting for a storyteller to give them a new name? Even today, beneath the sun of Santorini, a modern name for Thera, the earth holds its breath. The whitewashed houses of Thera cling to the caldera rim, their walls dazzling in the midday glare. Tourists sip wine grown in volcanic soil, unaware that they are standing on the rim of a sleeping beast. The sea inside the caldera is so still it seems solid, a disk of polished blue. And on those rare afternoons when the wind drops entirely, the locals still joke about the bells low, patient, measured as though some sunken city is calling to the living. The archaeologists who excavated Akrotiri began with no such stories in their minds. In the 1960s, under the blistering light of the Aegean, Spyridon Marinatos led his team down into the compacted ash. What they found stunned them. Streets perfectly preserved, lined with 2- and 3-story houses. Staircases intact, jars still holding their last cargo. Unlike Pompeii, there were no bodies, no frantic tableau of people caught mid-flight. The ash had buried an emptiness. Marinatos guessed what the absence meant. The tremors before the great eruption must have been warning enough. The people had fled. Whether they escaped entirely or met their fate elsewhere, no one could yet say. But the city itself had been sealed in its last moment of calm. Frescoes still gleamed in their ochre and blue, as though they had been painted yesterday. In one, a flotilla of ships moves between harbors, flags streaming in a wind that had not yet turned to fire. To walk those streets in the hush of excavation was to step into a kind of dream so complete, so immediate, that the imagination could not resist hearing it. The footfall of sandaled steps, the creak of wooden carts, and faintest of all, that deep and measured toll. The bells again. Always the bells. Of course, bronze bells as we think of them now were rare in the Minoan world. Their sound would have been more like a struck gong or the ringing of metal bowls used in ritual. But in the centuries of retelling, sound becomes symbol. The fisherman's tale of a strange echo beneath his oar becomes a merchant's claim that he heard the temple bells calling from below. The merchant's claim becomes a priest's sermon on the arrogance of a city that would not hear its own warning. And in time, the sound needs no explanation. It is simply the voice of the lost. The sea remembers differently. Somewhere beneath that perfect blue lies the broken crown of the volcano, its edges scalloped by collapse. The walls of the caldera drop away so steeply that light barely reaches the bottom. Down there, in the pressure and dark, currents shift across the ruins like ghosts rearranging their rooms. Each year divers descend, but the depths are treacherous. Sudden cold, erratic surges, and a fine silt that blooms into blindness at the touch. And yet, there are those who swear the silt hides streets, that the shape of walls can be felt, if not clearly seen. That a hand laid flat against the stone can feel a faint hum, as if the rock itself is holding a memory. It is here that history and legend cannot be made to part. We know the dates, the layers of ash, the path of destruction. We can reconstruct the pottery, the tools, the grain in the storehouses. But we cannot keep the bells from tolling in the stories. They do so as naturally as the tide, pulling memory toward myth until the two are inseparable. And if you stand at the edge of the caldera in the last light of day, watching the water turn from gold to indigo, you may find yourself leaning just a little closer to listen, not for the laughter of tourists or the call of seabirds, but for something slower, deeper, older, a rhythm that feels like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Plato never saw Thera. By the time he set ink to papyrus, the island's great wound had been scabbed over by centuries of sun and wind. Its story filtered through generations of sailors, priests, and poets. Yet he gave Atlantis a precision of place and scale, a voice of moral authority. It was not just a drowned city. It was a warning to all who built their greatness on fragile ground. His dialogues placed it beyond the pillars of Heracles, far from the Aegean, but the tone of its ending feels uncannily close to the ruined Thera left behind. In Plato's hands, the destruction was not merely natural, but just the gods, offended by human arrogance, sent storms and earthquakes to humble the city. That framing divine punishment for hubris would cling to the Atlantis story for the next 2,000 years. Medieval chroniclers, hearing echoes of the tale, folded it into biblical floods and pagan cautionary myths. Renaissance scholars, enchanted by the rediscovery of classical texts, searched for its location on every new map. Each age gave Atlantis the face it wanted: a paradise lost, a cautionary fable, a blueprint for utopia. But in the Aegean, where the sea laps against the bones of the Minoan world, the story remained less philosophical and more personal. Here, the elders spoke not of divine justice, but of the fragility of good fortune. They told of ships that never came home, of fields that yielded only dust, of voices in the water that could not be silenced. To a fisherman, the myth was not about pride, but about survival, about reading the signs the earth gives before it takes everything away. In the centuries after the eruption, the Mycenaeans rose in place of the Minoans. They built fortresses of stone, walls as thick as ambition, palaces where gold gleamed by torchlight. Their ships sailed the same waters, now unchallenged. Yet even in their triumph, they inherited the ghosts of the islands they ruled. In their stories, the sea was never empty. It was a realm of powers, both divine and dead. And somewhere below the surface, a city still dreamed in the dark, its bells tolling for whoever might listen. The bells themselves entered the written record much later, when travelers in the early modern period began collecting the local tales of Santorini. Some were priests, mapping the spiritual landscape of the islands. Others were merchants or scholars, chasing curiosities. They wrote of calm days when the water inside the caldera seemed to speak. The sound was described as hollow, solemn, and slow, like iron or bronze struck deep below. The rational minds among them blamed it on the shifting of the submerged volcanic slopes. But the locals, when pressed, only smiled and said the city was reminding them it was still there. In the 19th century, as archaeology began to touch the ancient Aegean, the bells took on a new kind of weight. Writers imagined them as the last relic of a temple dedicated to some forgotten god, perhaps Poseidon himself. Painters, inspired by both the excavations and Plato's words, rendered them as great bronze towers in a sunlit city, toppled in an instant and swallowed whole. The bells were no longer just a sound. They were a bridge between the known and the imagined, the real and the ideal. And still, the earth would not stay quiet. Santorini erupted again in 1650, in 1707, in 1866, each time reminding those who lived there that the peace of the caldera was an illusion. None of these events were on the scale of Thera's great death, but each sent the islanders back to their stories, listening for the signs. And each time, someone claimed they had heard the bells in the hours before the ash or smoke appeared. What is it about such a sound unprovable, unmeasurable, that holds so firmly in the human mind? Perhaps it is the way it carries both warning and mourning. A bell can call the living to gather, but it can also toll for the dead. In the case of Atlantis or Thera, the distinction may not matter. The bells do not call us to rescue the city. They call us to remember it. Marinatos, in his early reports from Akrotiri, hinted at this in his own way. Though he was a man of science, meticulous in his documentation, he admitted that walking among the preserved walls could be disorienting. One feels, he wrote, that the inhabitants have just stepped out and that their return is imminent. It was as if the city was holding its breath, listening to the sea outside, waiting for some signal to wake again. And perhaps that is why the myth has endured where so many others have faded. The bells of Atlantis are not a thing we can find in silence. They live in the space between history and longing, in the human need to believe that the past is not entirely gone. We build cities, we lose them, and we tell stories about how they might still exist, somewhere just out of reach. Standing on the edge of the caldera at night, the water black and perfectly still, you might think of the Minoan sailors who once crossed this bay. You might think of Plato shaping his parable. You might think of the divers feeling their way along a submerged wall. And if in that moment you hear something low and slow moving through the dark, whether it is the groan of rock or the strike of a hidden bell, you will know you are part of the same long chain of listeners. The trouble with ghost stories is that they are never finished. They rise, sink, and surface again with each telling. Atlantis, whether born from Plato's mind, Thera's eruption, or some older and nameless memory, has been carried on the currents of language for more than 2 millennia. Each age drapes it in its own garments. A moral tale, a lost Eden, a map to treasure, a warning for civilizations that grow too sure of themselves. And yet, if you strip away the layers, there is always the same kernel. A place, alive with people, gone in an instant. Not faded, not conquered, gone. The suddenness is what gives the bells their power. They do not ring for the slow decay of empires. They toll for a heartbeat that stops without warning. The Minoans left no written account we can read. Their script, Linear A, remains undeciphered. If they wrote about the eruption, about the long days of ash and the empty harbors, those words are still locked away. What we have instead are objects. A potter's wheel abandoned mid-spin, a fresco of lilies still vivid after 3,000 years, a copper adze worn to the haft, things that waited patiently under ash for someone to find them, like shells washed up from a deeper sea. And here the bells enter again, whether we invite them or not. The sound is not in the pottery or the tools, it's in the mind of the one holding them, in the space between the artifact and the hand that made it. The bell tolls for that distance. In our own time, scientists have mapped the caldera floor, tracing its jagged rim and its deep central pit. They have found terraces that may be nothing more than the shape of collapsed rock, or they may be streets, now paved in coral and silt. Instruments lowered into the deep sometimes record tremors, small movements in the volcanic heart. Occasionally, they record sounds too, low-frequency pulses that could be volcanic gas escaping, or the groan of shifting stone. No one has yet proven the bells exist, and yet no one can quite banish them either. Sailors still tell of hearing something on windless days, a sound that makes you think of empty harbors and forgotten names. Divers still emerge, claiming they felt a vibration in their bones. And tourists, standing at the caldera's rim, sometimes grow quiet without knowing why. It is easy to think of Atlantis as something separate from us, a dream city sunk far away, belonging to an age of gods and heroes. But the truth is that every shoreline holds its own Atlantis. Floods and quakes and storms have claimed more ports than we can count. What survives are the stories, each with its own bells. Perhaps that is the real endurance of the myth. Not the precision of Plato's account, not the search for a single location, but the recognition that our cities are fragile. Our pride is fleeting, and the earth keeps its own time. The bells toll, and we listen not because we expect the city to rise, but because in the sound we hear the measure of our own impermanence. And so the bells of Atlantis ring on, deep and slow, somewhere beneath the surface. They ring for Thera, for the Minoans, for every harbor swallowed by the sea. They ring for us too, though we prefer not to think about it. On calm days, they sound closer. On stormy days, farther. But they are always there, somewhere just beyond the reach of our hands, telling a story we cannot quite remember and will never fully forget. If you find yourself, one evening, standing where the sea meets the dark, and you hear a sound like bronze struck under water paws. Listen, you are not the first to hear it. You will not be the last. This has been the Archive of Folly. Until we meet again, keep listening for the places the world has taken, and the echoes they leave behind.